The gavel struck with a sound like a gunshot, silencing the crowded courtroom. All eyes turned to the defendant's chair, where a young black teen, no older than 17, sat stiffly in a cheap suit 2 sizes too big. His hands trembled slightly on the table before him. His eyes, though dark and alert, were lowered, avoiding the gaze of the white judge who towered over him from the bench like a god ready to strike lightning. "Name," the judge barked, not as a question, but as a demand. The boy raised his head slowly, swallowing hard. "Darian Cole, Your Honor." Judge Richard Halverson smirked, leaning back in his chair with the weight of a man who had seen too many like Darian before, or so he thought. He didn't see a boy, he saw a stereotype. Another delinquent from the wrong side of town, one more name to run through the grinder, one less problem on the streets. "Well, Mr. Cole," the judge drawled, his voice soaked in disdain. "I hope you enjoyed your little crime spree, because from what I see here, you're about to enjoy a very long stay behind bars." A few people in the courtroom chuckled. The bailiff didn't even hide his grin. The public defender at Darian's side looked bored, flipping through papers with mechanical indifference. Darian said nothing. He didn't need to, not yet. Let them believe what they wanted. Let them smirk. Let them label him. He'd spent his entire life being underestimated, misread, and pushed aside. This courtroom was no different, but he wasn't here to plead for mercy. He was here to win. And as Judge Halverson leaned forward, his tone dripping with superiority, Darian's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, in the shadow of a smile. The courtroom thought they were watching a lamb led to slaughter. They had no idea they were in the presence of a wolf. Judge Halverson adjusted his robe with theatrical slowness, then leaned forward with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "So," he began, voice low but venomous, "you can speak in full sentences. That's something. I was half expecting grunts and slang." Snickers rippled through the gallery. Darian didn't move. His eyes stayed down, trained on the table, but his jaw clenched just slightly. The judge flipped a page of the case file with mock curiosity. "Arrested with stolen electronics. No priors, that we know of. But I suppose the neighborhood you come from doesn't exactly encourage keeping records, does it? I'm sure this isn't your first dance with crime, just the first time you got caught." Darian opened his mouth to speak. "Don't interrupt me," the judge snapped. "I'm still talking." The defense attorney, a disheveled, middle-aged man with a coffee stain on his tie, raised a finger halfway before letting it fall. He wasn't here to fight. He was just passing time until lunch. Halverson leaned back again, folding his hands. "You know what I hate most, Mr. Cole," he said slowly. "The arrogance. You all come in here, chin up, thinking the world owes you something. Wearing suits your mother's probably bought with food stamps, trying to look respectable. But we know what's underneath, don't we?" Silence. The judge smirked, sensing dominance. "I see your type every week, poor, angry, fatherless. You act tough on the street, but the moment you're in front of real authority, you shrink, like now." Darian's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Is there anything you want to say for yourself?" the judge asked, with false interest, knowing full well what kind of performance he expected. A stammering, apologetic mess. Darian looked up. His voice was quiet, almost inaudible. "I didn't do it." The courtroom laughed. "You didn't do it," the judge repeated, chuckling. "Of course. And I'm the Pope. Spare me the street sob story. You'll have plenty of time to write your memoir in prison." He slammed the file shut. "This is the problem with your generation. No respect, no accountability, just excuses and attitude. You think you're smarter than the system. Newsflash, son, you're not. You're in my courtroom now. And in here, your kind doesn't win." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A sharp twist of anger coiled in Darian's stomach, not from the insults, not from the racism, but from how easily the room accepted it. No one flinched. No one stood up. Not the jury, not the clerk, not even his own defense. They didn't see a boy. They saw a conviction waiting to happen. But the judge made a fatal mistake. He thought Darian was broken. He had no idea Darian was preparing to strike. The courtroom was still, as if the air itself had thickened from the tension. Judge Halverson sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the wood of the bench. He was enjoying this, basking in the glow of his own supposed superiority. The courtroom was filled with the soft murmurs of those who had witnessed the scene unfold. The mocking words, the cutting insults, and, most importantly, the submission of a young black boy who seemed powerless in the face of it all. Darian didn't speak. Not a word. Not a movement. He just sat there, his eyes still trained on the table in front of him. His back was straight. His hands rested on the cool surface, the slightest tremor in his fingers betraying the calm he was trying so hard to maintain. Judge Halverson's voice broke the silence once more, as if to punctuate his dominance. "Well, Mr. Cole," the judge sneered, "you don't have a lot to say for yourself, do you? Thought you could waltz in here and make a mockery of the justice system? Well, I've got news for you. This isn't the streets. This is where real justice happens. You won't get away with this." The laughter from the gallery was sharp, cruel, and without mercy. Darian felt the heat of their stares, the judgment in their eyes as they watched him, expecting him to crumble under the weight of it all. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not now. His silence was calculated. His composure, a shield. What they didn't know, what they could never know, was that in the depth of his mind, a plan was beginning to take shape. It wasn't a plan that would come to life in the span of a few words or gestures. No, Darian's mind was far sharper than that. It was a slow burn, a strategy that would unfold over time, one calculated move after another, a plan that would leave everyone, especially Judge Halverson, reeling. Darian had seen this before, far too many times. The way people like Halverson talked down to him, like he was nothing more than a statistic, a threat, something less than human. He had seen it in the glances on the street, in the store when people crossed the street to avoid him, in the classrooms where he had been underestimated and dismissed. He had been the subject of countless racist comments, veiled threats, and ugly assumptions. But it was in these moments, the moments when others thought they had him figured out, that he found his strength. He had learned long ago how to harness the power of silence, the ability to fade into the background, to be overlooked. It was a weapon, and right now, it was his greatest asset. Darian's mind raced with possibilities as he sat there in the oppressive silence. He knew what the judge thought of him. He could see the smugness in Halverson's eyes, could feel the disdain emanating from every word the judge spoke. The judge thought Darian was weak. He thought he was just another angry black kid from a broken home, a stereotype that needed to be put in its place. But Darian knew something the judge didn't. Darian was no fool. He had spent years studying the law, quietly learning the nuances of the system that so many others took for granted. His mother had always told him to keep his head down, to keep his thoughts to himself, but she had also taught him the importance of understanding the rules, how to use them to his advantage. Darian had always been a quiet observer, someone who listened more than he spoke, and he had learned a lot by doing so. But now, the time for silence was running out. He was about to turn everything the judge and everyone else thought they knew about him into a weapon of his own. The judge wasn't finished, of course. He would never be finished until he had completely crushed what was left of Darian's pride. He leaned forward again, his voice growing louder, more mocking. "You know, I don't think you even understand the gravity of this situation," Halverson continued. "You're going to prison for a long time, boy, and I'm going to make sure of it. People like you, they never change. There'll always be trouble, always be a drain on society. I don't care how many books you read or how many times you get a good mark on your report card. You're still just another thug, just another criminal, and you'll never escape that label." There was a moment of silence after the judge's words, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of Darian's neck stand up. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the disdain, the hatred. It was palpable, but instead of breaking him, it only hardened his resolve. Darian shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers flexing. But he didn't say a word. No, he was playing the long game. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but he pushed it down. Anger wasn't the tool he needed right now. Patience was. The judge sat back, confident that his words had landed, that he had reduced Darian to nothing more than a trembling boy too scared to speak. But in reality, he had done the opposite. He had given Darian the fuel he needed, the catalyst to set his plan in motion. As the day wore on, the court continued its proceedings. But Darian's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't focused on the trial anymore. He wasn't concerned with the lies, the manipulations, or the injustice of it all. No, his focus had shifted to something much deeper. He was thinking about the system. He was thinking about how it worked, how it could be twisted and bent to serve him instead of the other way around. The silence he had maintained was the first part of his strategy. Let them think he was defeated. Let them believe they had broken him. But what they didn't know was that Darian had been planning for this moment for years. He had studied the law, learned its loopholes, its blind spots, its weaknesses. He knew how to turn every insult, every degrading comment, every racist stereotype into a weapon he could use. He knew how to manipulate the system against itself, and soon they would all see what kind of force they had unleashed. It wasn't just about getting out of this trial unscathed. No, this was about something far bigger. It was about exposing the lies that had been fed to him and everyone else like him. It was about dismantling the system that had taught people like Judge Halverson to treat him like a second-class citizen. It was about turning the tables and making sure that, in the end, it wasn't him who would be silenced. As the court session finally came to a close, Darian stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He looked at the judge, who was smirking at him from behind the bench. There was no fear in Darian's eyes, no hint of defeat. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, a promise. They hadn't broken him, not by a long shot. And when the time came, they would wish they had never underestimated him. Let's take a brief pause here. Please share in the comments where you're listening from, if you've experienced something similar in your life, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with new episodes. We'll continue shortly. Judge Halverson reveled in his power. His gavel had spoken, his voice had crushed any hope of defense, and now he was ready to deliver the final blows. The teenager, Darian Cole, sat in front of him like a caged animal, his silence fueling the judge's sense of superiority. Halvorsen knew the boy wasn't going to speak up. He had seen it before, the same stoic, broken expressions from those who had no voice left, those who had already been labeled, dismissed, and discarded by society. People like Darian were beneath him, and he was going to make sure the boy knew it. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stammered, his hands shaking slightly as he shuffled through his papers. "We request that you consider the circumstances. The boy has no prior record and—" Halverson raised a hand, cutting him off without even looking at the defense lawyer. "I'll decide what to consider, thank you very much," the judge said, his tone dripping with disdain. His eyes locked onto Darian's face, a sneer forming on his lips. "Now, let's talk about you, Mr. Cole." Darian didn't flinch. His hands were clasped together, his eyes downcast. He wasn't looking for mercy. He wasn't expecting anything but pain. The silence was the only thing he had left. Halverson leaned forward, the weight of his gaze pressing down on the young man like a physical force. "You're just another statistic, aren't you, Cole?" he sneered, his voice thick with venom. "Another one of these so-called victims of society. Another black kid who thinks he deserves better. Well, let me make something clear to you right now. You don't deserve better. You don't even deserve what little I'm about to give you." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick and suffocating. Darian's shoulders tensed as Halverson's words cut into him, but he remained silent. He had learned long ago how to endure this kind of torment, how to block out the noise and the venom. He wouldn't give Halverson the satisfaction of seeing him break. The judge continued, enjoying the power he felt as he degraded the boy in front of him. He had the courtroom's full attention now, and he wasn't about to let it go to waste. "You know, I've seen dozens like you come through here," Halverson said, now addressing the room. "You people always want a second chance, but what you really want is a free pass. You don't want to work for anything. You just want to take and take and take until there's nothing left. And now you think you deserve to walk out of here with a slap on the wrist." He turned back to Darian, his eyes narrowing. "Let me tell you, that's not how the world works. You've got to earn your place in this world, Cole. And you, my friend, haven't earned anything." The judge stood up and paced slowly in front of the bench, relishing the discomfort in the room, the way every word he spoke hung in the air like a weapon. "I know you're kind," he continued, his voice rising in anger. "You think the world owes you something because of the color of your skin. You think people like me are out to get you. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Cole. It's not the world that's against you. It's your own damn attitude." Darian's heart was pounding now, but he didn't let it show. His hands were still folded, his face impassive. The judge's words stung, but they weren't new. He had heard this all before. He had heard it from teachers, from neighbors, from strangers on the street. People who thought they knew him, who thought they knew what he was. But they didn't. Halverson smirked, savoring the moment. He was in control, and he knew it. The boy in front of him was nothing but a pawn in his game, a reflection of everything Halverson had come to despise in his career. The judge returned to his seat, his voice lowering, almost condescending. "And don't think for 1 second that your silence impresses me," he sneered. "You think by sitting there quietly you're showing some sort of strength. You're not. You're just proving that you have no spine, no real will to fight. You're exactly what I expected. A coward who hides behind his silence." The courtroom gasped at the insult, but Darian didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't react. In his mind, he was calculating, thinking of what came next, thinking of the bigger picture. He wasn't here for this petty cruelty. He was here for something far more important. The judge's words grew more venomous with each passing moment, his insults piling up with no regard for the young man in front of him. But Darian had stopped listening. He knew the judge's purpose was to humiliate him, to make him feel small and insignificant. But in that humiliation, Darian had found his power. It wasn't in the words the judge spoke, but in the silence Darian held in response. The more the judge raged, the more Darian's mind focused, the more the plan in his head began to solidify. He was being underestimated, just as he had been so many times before. But this time, he wasn't going to let it go. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous person in the room. Halverson, still enjoying his moment of dominance, didn't see it. He didn't see the glint of determination in Darian's eyes, the way the boy's jaw had clenched just slightly. He didn't see how Darian's silence was the calm before the storm. The judge, believing he was untouchable, believed that his insults had broken the teenager in front of him. What he didn't realize was that every word, every racist comment, every degrading remark was only feeding the fire inside Darian, preparing him for the moment when the tables would turn. Darian wasn't broken. Not yet. Not ever. But Halverson would be. The courtroom was buzzing with tension. The judge, having just delivered yet another blistering attack on Darian, was riding high on his sense of dominance. The audience hung on his every word as he made Darian the object of his latest round of humiliation. But amidst the chatter and the sneers, something in the air shifted. A quiet murmur rippled through the room as Darian finally raised his head, his eyes locked onto the judge's. The moment was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Something had changed. The young man sitting at the defendant's table, whom they had all underestimated, was no longer the broken soul they had believed him to be. Halvorsen looked down at Darian, savoring the moment. He expected to see fear in his eyes, a trace of regret, perhaps a hint of desperation. Instead, there was only a quiet, calculated resolve. The judge's smile faltered for just a moment. "What? No more words, Mr. Cole?" the judge sneered, growing bored with his own monologue. "I thought you'd at least try to defend yourself after all this time. You're not even worth the effort." Darian sat up straighter, his back no longer slouched. His posture, once meek and submissive, was now assertive and confident. He took a deep breath, almost as if preparing for a battle that had been building for far too long. "I think it's time for you to know who I really am, Judge," Darian said softly. But the words landed with the force of a thunderclap in the otherwise silent courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "What's this? Another one of your games? I think you've said enough for one day." But Darian wasn't playing games. This wasn't an act. He could see the judge's arrogance, his contempt for him, for all people like him. Halverson's face twisted into a sneer, a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "You know," Darian continued, his voice steady but powerful, "you're not the first person to try to break me down with words. You're not the first to call me names, to treat me like I'm nothing. But you're about to find out that I'm not what you think I am." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "My name is Darian Cole," he said, "and I'm not just some criminal in your courtroom. I'm not just another thug you've decided to punish. I am a law student, currently completing my final year at one of the most prestigious universities in the country." The words hung in the air like a bomb, and for the first time, there was a shift in the room. Murmurs spread across the gallery, people exchanging confused looks, unsure of what to make of what they had just heard. Even the judge, for the first time in this entire trial, looked slightly unsettled. Darian wasn't done. "I've spent the last few years learning the law, studying how the system works. And unlike you, Judge, I understand it. I know every loophole, every tactic, every manipulation. I've seen your kind before. The ones who wear their biases and hate like a badge of honor. You think you're above everyone else, above the law, but you're wrong." The judge's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had been so sure of his power, so certain that Darian was just another hopeless case. The reality hit him like a wave. You're a law student," the judge stammered, incredulous. But you're just a kid. You're supposed to be some criminal, a black kid with no future. You're not supposed to be this." Darian's voice was cold, cutting through the judge's disbelief. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you earlier. You assumed I was just a poor, angry teenager with no hope, didn't you? You thought I was nothing more than a stereotype, a thug, a criminal, someone with no chance of making it. You didn't bother to ask any questions. You didn't want to see what was really in front of you." The courtroom had gone completely silent. The judge, once the king of this courtroom, now looked like a man who had been stripped of his armor. He was no longer the towering figure of authority he had been earlier in the trial. Instead, he looked fragile, small, unprepared for the fight he was about to lose. Darian continued, his words sharp and deliberate. "I didn't tell you who I was because I wanted you to see me for what I am, not for what you assumed me to be. I didn't need you to pity me or to sympathize with me. I just wanted you to see me as an equal. But you couldn't do that. You couldn't see past your own hatred, your own racism." Halverson's face was flush with anger now, his hands clenched into fists on the bench. "You think you can intimidate me with your fancy education," he spat. "You think because you've read a few books you can turn the tables on me. You're still just a black kid. You'll never be equal to people like me." Darian stood up slowly, his back straight and his eyes locked onto the judge's. "No, Judge. I don't need to intimidate you. I just need to show you the truth. And the truth is, the system you've spent your whole life defending is flawed. The truth is, you are not above the law. You are not invincible. And the truth is, you will be held accountable for your actions, whether you want to accept it or not." The courtroom was still, not a single person daring to speak. The judge, who had spent the entire trial making Darian feel small, humiliated and worthless, now looked like a man who had just realized he had been playing a game he didn't fully understand. A game where Darian had been the real master all along. Darian's words cut deeper than any sentence the judge could have handed down. It wasn't just about his education or his future. It was about breaking the chains of the stereotypes that had been forced upon him, of showing the world, and especially Halverson, that he was not what they thought he was. As Darian turned away from the judge, there was a collective breath held in the room. No one knew what would come next, but one thing was certain. The tables had been turned. The young man they had dismissed as a helpless victim was now the one in control, and Halverson was left to face the consequences of his own arrogance. Darian wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for every person who had ever been underestimated, for every person who had been told they didn't belong. And in that moment, he had won. The room was electric with tension, the air thick as the weight of Darian's revelation settled over everyone. For the first time since the trial began, the atmosphere had shifted. The spectators, the jury, the prosecutor, and even the defense were all silently absorbing the shock of what Darian had just unveiled. The judge, who had once felt invincible, now looked like a man who had been caught in a trap of his own making. The sense of control he had wielded was slipping, and he could feel it. Judge Halverson straightened in his chair, trying to compose himself, but the damage was done. Darian was no longer the silent, weak teen he had dismissed so easily. He had revealed himself as someone far more dangerous. The courtroom had become a battlefield, and every word Darian spoke was a precise strike aimed at destroying the judge's authority. "Do you really think this is going to intimidate me, Mr. Cole?" Halverson snarled, his voice shaking with anger. "You think because you have some book knowledge, you can walk in here and take over? You're still just a black kid from the wrong side of town. You'll never be equal to me. You'll never be anything but what you are. A criminal." The words were venomous, the judge desperately trying to hold on to whatever scraps of power he had left. But Darian wasn't fazed. His eyes were calm, his posture still unwavering. He had expected the outburst. He had prepared for it. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The system had been rigged against him from the start, but now the rules were changing. And Darian was in control. "I'm not here to intimidate you, Judge," Darian replied, his voice steady. "I'm here to show you that you're not above the law, that you've misjudged me, and now you're going to pay the price for that." Halverson's face twisted with contempt. He slammed his hand down on the bench, the sound echoing through the room. "You think you can make me pay?" He spat. "You think because you've read a few books, you can challenge me? You're nothing but a punk, hiding behind your so-called education, thinking you can outsmart me. I'll make sure you get what's coming to you, just like everyone else who thinks they can play me." The judge's words were becoming more desperate, more filled with rage. He was no longer the confident figure he had been at the start of the trial. He was unraveling, but Darian, cool and composed, remained silent for a moment, letting the judge's words hang in the air. The tension in the room was palpable now, as if everyone was waiting for something to give. The prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged uneasy glances. The jury was silent, watching, waiting. Even the court officers, usually stoic, seemed on edge. Darian finally spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've spent your entire career using your power to break people like me, to crush those you deem inferior. But now, you're facing someone who sees through your lies. You're nothing more than a man with a badge, using that badge to uphold a broken system." Halverson's face reddened with fury. "You're a fool if you think you can win this. You think people like me don't know how to deal with arrogant little punks like you." He sneered, leaning forward on the bench. "I'll make sure you regret this. I'll make sure you never get another chance to ruin lives like you're trying to ruin mine." The courtroom was silent, save for the harshness in the judge's voice. Everyone was watching as Halverson began to lose his grip on the proceedings. His words had become less coherent, his anger more evident, his control slipping further with each sentence. It was clear to everyone in the room that he was no longer the one in charge. But Darian, in contrast, remained calm. He wasn't rattled by the judge's outbursts. He was focused, his mind sharp. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting to expose the system, to show the world that someone like him, someone they had written off, could stand up and win. "You're so desperate to hold on to your power, Judge," Darian continued, his voice quieter now, but every word carrying the weight of truth. "But it's slipping away from you. You've been using people like me for years, using your position to enforce your prejudices. But you can't break me. I won't let you." The judge was visibly shaking now, his face twisted in rage. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, his words no longer having the same effect. He had underestimated Darian from the beginning. And now, in the presence of the young man's unwavering confidence, the judge was unraveling in front of everyone. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind a robe and a gavel," Halverson shouted. "You think you can stand up to me? You'll never win. Never." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on everyone. Darian stood tall, his gaze unwavering, while the judge's world crumbled around him. This was no longer a trial. It was a battle for respect, for dignity, for the truth. And Darian had already won. The judge's face was now an unhealthy shade of red, his fists clenched on the bench, and it was clear to everyone that he was fighting a losing battle. Every word Darian spoke was a nail in the coffin of Halverson's authority. The courtroom was now on the edge of something monumental, and no one could predict what would happen next. But one thing was certain. Darian had taken control of the situation, and in doing so, he had turned the tables on a system that had long oppressed him. Now, the question wasn't whether he would win. It was whether the judge would be able to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom had transformed into a war zone. The battle between Darian and Judge Halverson wasn't just about a trial. It had become something far more personal. The judge, once so confident, now appeared desperate, clutching to his old, comfortable prejudices as his world crumbled. But for Darian, the fight was no longer just about winning the case. It was about exposing the deep-seated racism that pulsed through the very fabric of the system. Judge Halverson, red in the face with fury, slammed his gavel down, his voice now tinged with open hostility. "Enough of your games, Cole," he barked, his words venomous, filled with disdain. "You think you've got the upper hand because you've read a few books, because you've managed to squeeze yourself into some law school. You're still just a boy who doesn't know his place." Darian could feel the venom in every syllable, the judge's words deliberately chosen to slice through him like a knife. But instead of shrinking, instead of flinching, Darian stood firm. The judge's hatred was no surprise. It was all too familiar. The deep, institutionalized contempt for someone like him, a young black man from a broken neighborhood who dared to challenge the status quo. "Your kind doesn't belong in my courtroom," the judge continued, his voice laced with scorn. "You don't belong in a place like this. You were never meant to have this kind of power. People like you, people of your background, are supposed to know their place. And you," Halverson pointed a shaking finger at Darian, his face twisted in disgust. "You've forgotten it." The words stung, but Darian didn't show it. He had heard it all before. He had heard it from strangers, from classmates, from people who thought they knew him simply because of the color of his skin. But this time, it wasn't just some random passerby or a misguided teacher. It was the embodiment of a system that had spent centuries keeping people like Darian in their place. The judge's words were dripping with racism now, no longer veiled in the pretense of professionalism. This wasn't just personal. It was institutional. This wasn't just a fight between a defendant and a judge. It was a fight between a young black man and a system designed to break him. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" the judge sneered. "You think that just because you've got a fancy degree and a couple of big words that you can step into my world and turn it upside down. You don't get to do that. You don't get to rewrite the rules." The courtroom was silent, save for the sharpness of the judge's voice. It felt like the walls were closing in on Darian, like the weight of centuries of systemic oppression was pressing down on him all at once. But instead of breaking, Darian found his resolve strengthening. The more the judge spoke, the more Darian understood that the battle wasn't just for his freedom. It was for every person who had been crushed under the weight of racism, under the weight of a system that told them they didn't matter. "You're just a black kid from a broken home. the judge continued, his voice seething with contempt. You don't deserve any of this. You're not worthy of being in this room, in this position. You're just a product of the system, a failure waiting to happen. And I'll make sure of that. Darian's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he had to do. Judge, Darian said, his voice cutting through the venom in the room. You think you can break me, don't you? You think that by throwing these insults at me, by using your position to belittle me, that I'm going to crumble. But you're wrong. Every word you say, every insult you throw at me, it only proves me right. It only proves that you are exactly the kind of person I'm fighting against. It proves that you are the one who is truly broken. The room was silent again. The weight of Darian's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The judge, who had once ruled the courtroom with an iron fist, now looked uncertain, his mask of authority cracking under the pressure. You are a disgrace to the position you hold, Darian continued, his voice strong, unwavering. You hide behind your gavel, your title, and you use them to hurt people like me. You think you're above the law, above everyone else, but you're not. You've spent your life oppressing people who are just as capable, just as deserving, and just as human as you. You've spent your life trying to tear us down, but what you don't understand is that every time you try, you only make us stronger. The judge's face was turning a deeper shade of red, his eyes bulging with fury. His hands were trembling as he gripped the edge of the bench, trying to regain control, but it was slipping from him. The power he had once held over Darian was now gone, replaced by the raw force of the truth. You can call me whatever you want, Darian went on, his voice now rising with a calm intensity. You can tell me that I don't belong here, that I'm a failure, that I'll never be like you. But I'm not like you. I'm better than you. I'm better because I'm not afraid to face the truth, to look at the system that has crushed so many people and say, enough. The courtroom was still. There was no sound except for the heavy breathing of the judge, who was now visibly shaken, his mouth working but unable to form coherent words. Darian had taken the fight out of him. Every racist remark, every attempt to break him had only fueled his fire. You might have the power in this room, Darian said quietly, his gaze unwavering. But the truth is with me, and I'll be damned if I let you keep hurting people like me. You can try to tear me down, but I'll stand tall. And when all of this is over, you'll be the one who's broken. The judge's face twisted with rage, but his words were now hollow, powerless. The moment had shifted. The tables had turned. Darian had won the battle, and in doing so, he had shown the world just how deep racism ran, how it was embedded in the system, in people like the judge, who thought they could use their power to break others. But Darian wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every single person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Every person who had been crushed by the weight of oppression. And now, with the judge's authority broken, the true fight for justice was just beginning. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Judge Halverson's once ironclad authority had been shattered, and now, standing at the center of it all, Darian was more composed than ever. His victory, once just a glimmer of hope, had turned into an undeniable reality. But the battle was far from over. The judge, though exposed and vulnerable, still had a position of power, and Darian knew he would try everything to cling to it. What he didn't know was that Darian had already planned for this. He had turned the tables, but now he was going to make sure that the judge would dig his own grave, step by careful step. Halvorsen, his face red with rage and humiliation, leaned over the bench, glaring down at Darian with a look that could burn through steel. His voice was seething with venom. You think you've won, don't you, Cole? The judge spat. You think because you've rattled me, you've somehow beaten me. Well, you're wrong. You're still a black kid who doesn't belong here, and no matter what you say, no matter what little tricks you pull, I'm the one in charge. Darian's eyes remained steady, unflinching. He could hear the words, feel the weight of the racism dripping from them, but he wasn't bothered. In fact, he almost welcomed it. Every racist comment, every insult thrown his way, was another step toward his ultimate victory. What the judge didn't realize was that Darian had already outsmarted him. The game had shifted, and the judge was playing right into his hands. "Is that really what you think, Judge?" Darian asked, his voice calm and level. "You still think this is about me rattling you? It's about you losing control, isn't it? You've been using your power to break people like me for so long, but now it's you who's unraveling. And I don't need to do a thing to make that happen. You're doing it all on your own." Halverson's face twisted with fury. He gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he sneered. "You think just because you've managed to rattle me with your little words, you can make a fool of me. I'll make sure you regret this. You'll be behind bars for the rest of your life, and I'll make sure of it." Darian didn't react to the threat. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his calmness a stark contrast to the judge's growing hysteria. "You're right about one thing, Judge," Darian said, his voice low but full of intent. "You will make sure of it. You'll make sure of my downfall. But it won't be me who falls, will it? It'll be you." The judge's eyes narrowed, his breath coming in short bursts. He was furious, but Darian could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The judge wasn't just angry now. He was scared. His grip on power, his comfort in assuming people like Darian were beneath him, he was losing that grasp, and Darian knew it. "You want to know why?" Darian asked, almost like he was speaking to a child who needed to be taught a lesson. "Because you've spent your entire life playing by the same rules. You've used your power to silence, to break, to oppress. But now, Judge, you're up against someone who's been watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment. And now, you're playing in my game." The room grew tense again, the air thick with the weight of Darian's words. The judge opened his mouth, clearly desperate to strike back, but Darian was already several steps ahead. "I've been quiet this whole time, haven't I?" Darian continued, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I've let you say everything you wanted to say. I've let you run your mouth, spew your hatred, and assume that I would just crumble under it. But the thing is, Judge, you've underestimated me. You've underestimated who I am and what I'm capable of." Halverson's face turned even more crimson, and for a moment, it seemed as if the judge might explode with rage. He slammed his fist onto the bench, the sound reverberating through the room. "You're nothing but a liar," the judge shouted. "A little boy who thinks he can play the system. You don't know anything about real power, about real authority. You're just a product of a broken system, my system, and I will make sure it swallows you whole." Darian's eyes never wavered. The judge's outbursts only served to solidify his belief in his own power. The more the judge raged, the more Darian felt his control over the situation solidify. Each insult, each outburst was like a gift. The judge was falling deeper into his own trap. "You think you're in control, don't you?" Darian said, his voice quieter now but cutting through the judge's words like a blade. "You think you have power over me, over everyone in this room. But what you don't realize is that power is nothing without respect. You have no respect for anyone who doesn't look like you, who doesn't think like you, and you think that gives you the right to tear me down, to strip me of my dignity." Darian stood up slowly, his presence commanding attention, the entire room now hanging on his every word. "You call me a liar," Darian said, locking eyes with Halverson. "But the truth is, Judge, it's you who's been lying. You've lied to yourself your entire life, telling yourself that people like me can't outsmart you, can't challenge you, and now I'm here to show you just how wrong you are." The judge flinched at the final words, his fists tightening around the edge of his bench. He tried to speak, to regain some semblance of control, but his words faltered. The courtroom was silent, and for the first time in the entire trial, the judge seemed small, vulnerable. Darian's calmness was his weapon. Every word he spoke was carefully chosen, every sentence a calculated strike against the judge's growing panic. Halverson had thought Darian was a powerless teenager, a pawn in his game. But now, Darian was playing the game, and he was winning. "You want to silence me?" Darian said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. You want to break me? But here's the thing, Judge. Every time you try, every time you attack me, it just proves how weak you really are. You've spent your entire life oppressing people like me, but look where we are now. The judge sat back, defeated for the moment, his hands shaking. Darian had drawn him into a psychological trap, and now the judge was the one on the defensive. Each word Darian had said had worked like a hammer, driving the final nails into the coffin of the judge's authority. You won't win this, Judge, Darian said, his voice steady and filled with finality. Not because of the law, not because of the system. You won't win because you've lost the only thing that truly matters, your integrity. And once that's gone, there's nothing left. Halverson's jaw clenched, but no words came. He had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered by the very person he had tried to break. The psychological battle was over, and Darian had claimed victory. The room remained silent, the weight of Darian's victory settling over everyone. The judge's power, his dominance, had crumbled under the weight of truth, and Darian, with remarkable calm, had ensured that he would never be silenced. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Halverson, once the embodiment of authority and control, was now visibly shaking, his grip on the gavel no longer steady. The moment he had tried so hard to maintain was slipping from his fingers, and Darian, ever calm and composed, had seized the reins of the situation. It was no longer a trial. It had become a spectacle, and Halverson was at the center of his own unraveling. The judge, his face flushed with rage, slammed his fist against the bench, his voice cracking with desperation. "Enough!" he shouted, his eyes wild with fury. "This ends now. You think you've won, but you've only succeeded in making a mockery of this courtroom. You think you can outsmart me, but I've seen people like you before. I know how to deal with people like you." Darian stood unfazed, his posture straight and unyielding. He had known this moment was coming. He had anticipated the judge's breakdown, the inevitable eruption of the power that had once made him untouchable. But now, that power was slipping away, and Halverson's attempts to cling to it only made his collapse more spectacular. "You're just a product of the system," the judge continued, his voice rising with each word. A black kid with a chip on his shoulder, trying to make a name for himself. "You don't belong here. You don't belong in this courtroom, and you certainly don't belong in my seat. You're nothing more than an angry, misguided little boy trying to make people believe your lies. But I won't let you do that. Not on my watch." Darian's eyes remained fixed on the judge, his expression unwavering. He could see it now. The desperation, the fear, the unraveling of a man who had once believed he was untouchable. But now, every word, every attempt to belittle Darian, was a reflection of his own loss of control. "Do you honestly think that by shouting louder, by demeaning me, you can salvage anything?" Darian asked, his voice cutting through the judge's tirade like a scalpel. "The truth is, Judge, your power is gone. You've spent your entire career hiding behind your gavel, using it to suppress people like me. But now, your authority is meaningless. You are no longer in control, and you never will be again." Halverson's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the bench, his entire body shaking with rage. "You think you're so smart," he spat. "You think that just because you've been able to rattle me, you've won. Well, I won't let you get away with it. You'll regret this, Cole. I'll make sure you regret every second of it." His words were venomous, but the cracks in his facade were obvious to everyone in the room. The courtroom was no longer quiet. The spectators shifted in their seats, the murmurs growing louder as they witnessed the judge's loss of composure. It was clear now. Halverson was no longer the one in charge. "You think you can intimidate me by lashing out," Darian said, his voice calm but sharp. "But it's not working. Every word you speak, every outburst, only proves how weak you are. You've lost, Judge. You've lost everything. And now you're trying to convince yourself and everyone else that you still have power. But you don't. The truth is, you've been losing control this entire time, and now there's no going back." Halverson's eyes widened with fury, and his face twisted into a mask of contempt. "I'll make sure you never see the light of day again," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "You'll rot in prison, and I'll make sure of it. You'll never get away with this." But Darian wasn't fazed. The more the judge shouted, the more desperate he became. The more it became clear that Halvorson was losing not just the battle, but his mind. His grip on the proceedings was slipping, and the harder he fought to maintain it, the more his control unraveled. The aggressive outbursts, the threats, only made him look like a man on the brink of a breakdown. "You think your threats still matter?" Darian replied, his tone cool, almost detached. "You think your power can intimidate me? You're wrong. All you're doing is making it even clearer that you're nothing but a man who's afraid of losing control. And that fear is what's going to be your undoing." The judge's face had now turned a deep shade of red. His fists clenched so tightly around the bench that his knuckles were white. His mouth moved, but no words came out. He was sputtering, gasping for control, but it was slipping further away with each passing second. "I've seen it all before," Halvorson finally managed to spit out, his voice low and tremulous. "People like you always think they can beat me. You think because you've got a law degree, you can beat the system. You think you can outsmart me, but I'm the one in charge. And you," his voice cracked with frustration, "you're nothing." But Darian wasn't listening anymore. His mind was focused, his body still, a perfect contrast to the judge's rapid descent into madness. "Every time you open your mouth," Darian said softly, "you're digging your own grave. You think you're powerful, but the truth is, you're weak. Every racist word, every insult, every threat just proves how fragile you really are." The room was silent now, the atmosphere heavy. The spectators watched as Halvorson crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance, his own fear. Darian's victory was no longer in question. The judge had already lost, and he didn't even realize it. Halvorson slammed his gavel one last time, but the sound was hollow, empty. The power he once held over the room was gone. And Darian, standing tall, watching with cold certainty, knew that this was only the beginning. The judge had tried to break him, to crush him, to use his authority to bring him down. But it had backfired. Every move Halvorson made now only accelerated his own demise. Darian had played the game perfectly. And the judge, in his desperate bid to reclaim control, had lost everything. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the weight of the past few days settling heavily on everyone present. The battle between Darian and Judge Halvorson had reached its final act, but neither of them knew exactly how it would end. The tension was unbearable, and every breath seemed to carry the anticipation of the inevitable conclusion. What had started as a battle for freedom had become a personal war, with stakes higher than either of them could have predicted. Halvorson sat at the bench, slumped in defeat, his once strong posture shattered. The judge, who had spent years wielding power over others, now found himself caught in the very system he had abused for so long. His face was pale, his eyes red from the fury and humiliation that had consumed him. His arrogance, his racism, his desperate need to control, each had led him to this moment, where nothing was left but the bitter taste of failure. Darian stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the broken figure before him. He had won the battle, but the cost of that victory was far greater than he had anticipated. His mind raced, not with the joy of triumph, but with the weight of what lay ahead. He had never imagined that his own life would be forever altered by this moment, that the decision he made here would shape everything that came after. The prosecutor, who had once seemed so sure of their case, now sat quietly, watching the unfolding scene. The jury was stunned, unsure of what to make of the shocking turn of events. Even the defense attorney, who had tried his best to guide Darian through the trial, looked on in silence, unable to comprehend the full magnitude of what had just transpired. But as the silence stretched on, it became clear that the consequences of the past few days would not be confined to the courtroom. They would spill into the lives of everyone involved, and the true cost of this fight would be revealed in ways no one could have foreseen. Halvorson broke the silence first, his voice barely a whisper, but laced with venom. "You think you've won, don't you?" he muttered, his words heavy with self-loathing. You think you're better than me now, but you're nothing. You were always nothing. And in the end, it's people like you who will always lose. You'll never escape the system. You'll never escape the weight of your skin. His words, meant to wound, were the last desperate remnants of his power. But as they hung in the air, they only reinforced his own defeat. Darian, calm and unshaken, looked directly at the judge. "I never needed to be better than you, Judge," Darian replied, his voice steady. "But I will be better than the system that let people like you destroy lives for so long." The judge flinched, the weight of Darian's words hitting him harder than any of his previous insults. The courtroom remained still, as if time had stopped entirely, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. And then, the moment came, the realization that Halverson's fate was no longer in his hands. The consequences of his own actions had caught up with him. He was no longer the one deciding the lives of others. He was now the one facing the consequences of his own choices. But that wasn't the true tragedy. The true tragedy came when Darian, the very person he had tried to break, had to make a decision. A decision that would change everything. Darian could have walked away, could have let the system swallow Halverson whole, just as it had swallowed so many others before him. But as he stood there, watching the judge crumble in front of him, Darian realized something. He wasn't here for revenge. He wasn't here to destroy the judge or make him suffer. He was here to prove that people like him could fight back, that people like him could win. But at what cost? The moment of clarity was brief, but it hit Darian with an undeniable force. He had won. But in winning, had he lost something more important? Had he become part of the very system he had fought so hard to escape? The courtroom was silent as Darian made his decision. He looked at Halverson one last time, his expression unreadable. The judge, broken and defeated, couldn't even look him in the eye anymore. He was no longer the towering figure of authority. He was just a man who had fallen from grace. "I'm done here," Darian said, his voice quiet but resolute. "The system is broken, but I'm not going to let it break me, or anyone else, any longer." With that, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind not just the judge, but the legacy of the system that had allowed such abuse to thrive. The world outside awaited, and Darian knew his fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the door closed behind him, Halverson was left to face the consequences of his actions. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over the years was now nothing more than rubble. And the real tragedy was that he had no one to blame but himself. Darian's life, on the other hand, was just beginning. And in the years to come, he would remember this day not as the end of his battle, but as the first step toward changing everything.